We care a lot about intelligence and consciousness because they are aspects of mind and thought. And they also resonate with and bring us close to questions about origins and purpose and what's going on here. If you're traditionally religious, it also resonates with the idea of consciousness and consciousness of God. So it touches some of our deepest concerns. And I'm going to sort of do this like a sonata or a musical symphony of 4 movements. You know, and the movements, sometimes one ends and the next one starts, and it doesn't necessarily take right off. But when you see the whole piece all together, then they sort of come together. At least I'm hoping they will today. So let's get started. And the first thing I want to talk about are people who have thought about this question of consciousness and intelligence of the universe as a whole. It's pretty obvious that human beings are, at least in some cases and in some occasions, intelligent and conscious. But does it make sense to use those terms in relationship to the universe as a whole? So I want to talk about, first of all, some of the visionaries of the early part of the 20th century who had some things to say about this. And the first one is a philosopher named Henri Bergson. He was a French philosopher. He actually won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was an enormous and gigantic figure in philosophy during the 1910s, 1920s, up into the 1930s. And a lot of people paid enormous attention to what he had to say. And he had, being a philosopher, he had some things to say about time. And he also had some things to say about relativity. And this was before Einstein. And he had things to say about creativity and the nature of life. Now, the reason I mention this is that even though he was such a powerful figure, virtually nothing of Bergson's ideas, for the most part, survive today. And it's in part because these ideas were they were not rooted in actual experimental observation, about looking and studying it, how, in fact, if there is a mind, where is it? And how does it work? And what is its relationship to the brain? And indeed, it has a very powerful and important relationship. It is seated in the brain. And Bergson's philosophy just never went there. The thing that finally did Bergson in, so to speak, or where he realized he reached the end of what he could do, he was an elderly man at that point, but he at one point had a kind of debate with Einstein about relativity, and he just said it was beyond him. He'd kind of given it up. So, but 2 of the next generation after Bergson, 2 people I want to mention. The first is Vladimir Vernadsky. He's a Russian geologist. He also won a Nobel Prize. He was a very important figure in Russian science of the first half of the 20th century, and a very imaginative thinker. And it was in attending his lectures, he not only lectured in Russia, he came and lectured at the Sorbonne in France. And this man on the right, Teilhard de Chardin, was attending his lectures and met him and took up some of his ideas, some very important ideas. Has anybody else ever heard of Teilhard de Chardin? Okay, he was a paleontologist, also a Jesuit priest, and a very powerful thinker and a very vigorous man. He led incredibly rigorous expeditions into China looking for fossils. And he also wrote, and he wrote a very large number of books about, the most famous of which is The Phenomenon of Man, which is his take on trying to understand evolution within the context of Christianity. And he had a very mystical idea of Christianity. Sometime I might give a talk on de Chardin. He's a very fascinating and really a mystic. He's really a mystical figure. At any rate, between Vernadsky and de Chardin picked up an idea, sort of inspired maybe originally by Bergson, amplified by Vernadsky, and it was this idea. The idea was that the planet began, first of all, as minerals and condensed phases, the geosphere. It was purely geological. There wasn't any life form. And at some point, life began, and Vernadsky called the life period, or the era of life, and life's doings, the biosphere, as the previous purely geological forms of the land masses and the oceans and so forth were the geosphere. The new thing that he and de Chardin were kind of resonating together on was then the idea that there's a next step here which has to do with intelligence and consciousness, and that is mind. And so they posited this idea of the new sphere, and it comes from the Greek word nous, which means mind. That there's this period, this development, this evolution in which mind and thought and consciousness is sort of all over the place, in the air, is sort of blossoming like bloom. And it's clear that the new sphere is both intelligent and conscious. Let's just recall what we mean when we say intelligent and what we mean when we say conscious, because they are different. And I'm going to try to explain why it is that they're different. So intelligence, I like to think of as the ability to acquire knowledge and act on it to the flourishing of the entity that's doing that. Whether it's elementary particles, acquiring knowledge about the positions of other elementary particles and then executing their motions in accordance with the law of motion, or whether it's intelligent beings acquiring knowledge and using it purposefully. Consciousness is different. And one way we can think about it is that intelligence is a prerequisite to consciousness, but it's not sufficient. Consciousness is the ability to be aware of and monitor intelligence. The ability to know, that's intelligence. But consciousness is about knowing that you know, and other manifestations as well. So those are intelligence and consciousness, and we now move to the second movement, which I want to talk about. Intelligence is everywhere. The universe, we can properly say, is intelligent, because all of the entities of the universe, from elementary particles to more complex creatures, complex structures, have this ability to acquire information and to act on it. And if it's true for elementary particles, it's going to be true all the way up the line. So the universe is intelligent at all levels, in varying degrees. That's important. Not all levels of intelligence are equal in their power and capacity. Some of the intelligence is very simple, like the intelligence of elementary particles. They know how to do very simple things. But it's not necessarily, the universe is not necessarily conscious at all levels. And I realize that that's probably a somewhat controversial statement, but nonetheless I'm going to make it. I'm going to explain why it's not conscious at all levels. So, what intelligence and consciousness rest on? And this is going to be a little difficult, but it's so crucial. You can't understand anything about what it would mean for the universe to be intelligent or conscious without understanding that the universe is computational. And the first and most important computational network that we know about and that we are familiar with and that we use all the time is the one that we participate in as animals. It's the computational network that is neural. It's based on a nervous system in the nerves in our body as well as the nerves in our brain. That's what it's rooted in. That's the stuff that makes it go. I'm going to talk about other kinds of computational networks that are not neural. But we'll start with the neural. So, these are familiar. This is a photomicrograph into the cortex of a brain. These are some of the neurons. That's the neural body, and these fibers reach out and they form a network. And the network does the computation that makes it possible for you to understand what I'm saying right now, for your body to control all its functions and so on. Now, the neural networks are formed of synaptic on-off switches. And here's a picture of, some of you who have been to some of my talks before may have seen this picture before. I hope it's becoming familiar. It's so fundamental that you should kind of have it almost memorized by now. The nerve bodies send out axons which, when they touch other nerve bodies, here's a touch point here, here's another touch point. Where those touch points are connections, switches. That's where the nerve, the axon nerve, is hooking up to these other side nerves which are called dendrites. And what happens inside this nerve is that the dendrites send signals into the nerve body. They're out there like feelers, getting signals from other nerves whose axons are hooking onto them and touching them. So it's a computational network, and when the level of excitation gets high enough, it fires and sends out an impulse, which then goes to the other nerve bodies, and that's the way the network works. The thing I'd like you to notice is that synapses encode information, and that's really what they're doing. That's what it's all about. It's not about having something that's wet and got some ions in it and is warm tissue, and that's what nature's trying to make. No, nature's trying to make a natural computer. And one of the things that's important in computing is the switch. The ability to have something that can be either on or off. Because if you've got that ability, you can send a signal. You can store information. You can say whether the situation is yes or it's no. That is valuable information. And we often use zeros and ones to indicate the off and the on, but you could use plus and minus, A and B. Any kind of pair of symbols will work. So, if we have one synapse, we have a switch that can handle one bit of information. And I don't have the nerve here anymore, but it's basically when it's off, it's a 0. And when it's fired and it's hooked up and it's on, it's a 1. I'm just using that, but we could also call it B and A. The alphabet is rather arbitrary. The only thing we have to do is distinguish the two possibilities. And now, if we have 2 synapses, we have 2 bits. And I should say, I'm speaking very roughly here. It's not true that a synapse corresponds to exactly 1 bit in a conventional computational structure. They're actually quite a bit more complex in how they deal with these analog signals and manage to get them into digital form. So, but it's roughly the idea. It's not too far off the truth, but it's not exactly true that 1 synapse equals 1 bit. So if we have 2 bits, which means we have 2 switches, the first switch, when both switches are on, we have A and A, for example. When the first switch is off, it's now in the B state, and the second switch is off, it's in the B state. And then we have the other 2 possibilities. The first one could be off, and the second one could be on. The first one could be on, the second one could be off. We make 4 different words. We make the word AA, the word BB, the word BA, and the word AB. From 2 synapses, we are now speaking a language. We now have words. Words store information, and words are used to communicate information. Now, in neural computation, there's a very great power of combinatorics that takes place, that when you combine lots of really simple things, you take a switch that can either be on or off, you combine a bunch of them together, you get to have some very powerful computation. So if we had 8 bits, which is 8 synaptic switches that can either be on or off, that's 2 states, the number of possible words that you can make, the number of possible things you can describe is 2 to the power 8, which is 256. So there are 256 different things that 8 synaptic bits could roughly do. And a typical one, I just wrote a sample here, is AB, AAB, ABB. The 8 different switches are all lined up here, and this is their different states. Some of them are off and some of them are on. What that corresponds to are 256 different pieces of data stored in the brain, or 256 different actions to perform. Now again, that's not precisely correct, because I said there's not a one-to-one correspondence between synapses and bits. Okay, let's try now the third movement, which is about intelligence and consciousness in human beings. Now, those of you who have been to the earlier 2 talks I gave already have some idea about this, but it's going to be a little different today. We're going to take it a little farther. So, we have a brain and a nervous system, and that's where these synapses are, and that's where this computation is taking place. So here we are. Let's talk about intelligence and the brain. And here's the external world, and a subject in the external world. And here's a human body that has a brain, and it also has vision and sound and so on. So your eyes and your ears and your senses, smell, touch, all of these things are sending information through your nervous system, up through the brainstem, into your brain. Actually, the eyes go through the auditory nerves to the auditory cortex, kind of direct shot into the brain. And what we have here is a neural network that pulls in vision and sound and the other senses. And it also has other brain activity that's going on, which may want to, after it's pulled things into memory, will work on them and modify them, do actions, like if you see something that's falling, jump away, so on. That's the other brain activity that will take place based on the inputs from the senses. And that's intelligence. That is very intelligent behavior that's responding to what's happening in the environment and taking steps, purposeful steps with what is pulled in from the environment, acting on it, and so on. But it's not conscious. If you have in the brain, and human beings certainly seem to have it, sufficient numbers of neurons, and we have 100 trillion synapses and 100 billion neurons. We got a lot. You can almost think of it as we have the space to build several brains inside the brain. We have the elements to make a bunch of brains. And what consciousness is going to come about from is a second network existing in the brain with projections that can touch and connect to the first network. And the second network is not directly seeing, it's not directly touching with the senses or smelling and so on. What it's doing is observing the working of the first one. That's the gist of consciousness, of the brain having the capacity to observe its own operation. That gives the sense of the lights are on. That gives the sense of knowing that you know something, and so on. So human consciousness is about the brain observing itself interact with the body and the world. All right. Now, those are neurons, and they make a computational network from which intelligence and consciousness can both emerge. But it's not so much about neurons that I want to point out. The neuron is the vehicle. The neuron is the structure. Just like one of Intel's chips is the structure which does computation in your PC. It's not about whether it's an Intel chip or whether it might be, in fact, a purely mechanical computer based on gears and pulleys. There are such things. They're not very powerful, but you can make a computer that works with cams and levers and gears. You can also make one that works with balls, with billiard balls that bounce against each other and go into channels and come out in another spot, and they can compute. So it's not neurons, it's not billiard balls, it's not PC chips per se. There has to be a material medium that has the possibility to be either on or off, to be in two different states. And there are lots of different ways you can do that. And what's important about intelligence is that the network is sufficiently rich enough, and it doesn't even have to be that rich. The richer it is, the more intelligent it is. But even the most simple rudimentary network has elementary intelligence to do its on-off computation. But consciousness emerges from a computational network aware of and observant of its own operation. So the network not only is intelligent, it can do stuff, it is able to observe itself doing stuff. And that's why intelligence and consciousness are going to be different. Because if you have any kind of minimal computational complexity, just enough to do a switch going on and off, you have elementary intelligence. So if we plotted some measure of how intelligent something is, sort of like the IQ, and we measure its computational complexity, how many synaptic switches does it have, or how many chips does it have, how many billiard ball computing elements does it have, and so on, we can get a curve that's something like this. The more you have, the more complicated operations you can do that are more intelligent. But you have something, even if it's very small, even down to the minimal level of 1 bit. But in the case of consciousness, if the computational complexity of the entity in question, even if it's is just too low, it doesn't have that capacity to have that extra computing capacity to be watching itself. So you've got to have sufficient complexity. And so there's some point in which the computational complexity of some entity, maybe an animal brain or a microorganism, gets sufficient to the point that it reaches a threshold where it can watch itself, if I put it that way. And so when you have that awareness threshold, then now you start to become conscious. Now, this has implications for the consciousness of the universe as a whole, because it seems to say, although the universe is intelligent everywhere, it can't be conscious everywhere, because there are things that are just too simple to be having their self-observation. Now, I'll say more about this later, but you can say, well, maybe there's other agents involved, they're angels or they're gods, and the gods give people consciousness and they take care of all of that. So that's how it works. But I'm trying to look at this from a fairly rigorous point of view of what physics and biology tell us, because it's very easy to fantasize about intelligence and consciousness in the universe. It's a snap. And science fiction is just full of fantasies about creatures and how intelligent they are and how their consciousness works and so on. The challenge is to explain how this could be. And one of the important things is that all computation that we know of has to root in some material medium. It could be a billiard ball, it could be a neuron, it could be any of the other kind of chemicals that engage in computation. But the thing that's computing is not the billiard ball or the chemical or the PC chip. What's being computed is something much more beyond it. It's more like the mind. It's more like thoughts and ideas, and these are what's resting in that material medium. We'll say more about this later, because some people certainly will dispute this and say, well, you don't need that because God's in charge and God will take care of it. But I'm trying to present this from what we know most rigorously from the viewpoints of modern physics and modern biology. Okay, now let's talk about natural computational networks beyond animal brains. And this is something I think we're not very aware of. That the universe is full of intelligence, and the natural world is full of intelligence, and it's full of computation that's going on all the time. So remember our neural computer with the nerve signal off and the nerve signal on. Well, you got to have neurons to do that. Kind of neurons in animals. But you can have a chemical computer. A chemical computer is composed of several different chemicals that are interacting together, and when they interact together, they achieve and undergo chemical reactions, and they make products, and they create and destroy one another as they go about the reaction events in whatever it is they are subsisting in. So the chemical computer has an on-off switch. It's if a particular molecule in a solution or inside a cell, to make it more immediate to life, if there's no molecule present, the switch is open. It's off. But if that molecule is present, the switch is on. So again, it's a two-state situation. We have an ensemble of chemicals, and if it's present, it's on. If it's not present, it's off. And other molecules can take that molecule away by combining it with something else, or they can release it, in which case the switch comes on. Or if another molecule eats it up, combines it with something else, then that switch goes off. So you see that chemistry is a rich computational structure. The world of chemistry is computing all the time. So I want to show you just a little sample of a chemical computer, and it's going to be in the cell. See if I got a picture of that cell here. Maybe I don't. Yes, there it is. This is an E. coli cell. And it computes with chemical reactions that change the states of their biomolecules inside in response to the cell and its environment. Now, I think you probably know E. coli lives in the gut, and E. coli is responsible for doing digestion. And one of the things that E. coli does is metabolize sugars. So let's go back. So this chemical computer inside the cell, inside an E. coli cell, is based on the on-off switch of whether there's lactose present in the environment of the cell, if there's lactose in the gut, or whether there's no lactose in the gut, because maybe the animal didn't have any sugars that day. There's very little sugar in the gut. So there's no lactose signal. It's a chemical computer, it's an off and on, could be 0, 1, A, B, whatever. So here's how this chemical computer works. The E. coli bacterium has to produce proteins that will digest the sugar. It's got a long name, it's called beta-galactidose. Beta-galactidose is that protein. So it makes that protein when there's sugar, because that's what does the digestion. That protein is going to eat the sugar. So how does it make the protein? Well, it's got the recipe to make the protein in its DNA. So here's the DNA of the inside the E. coli cell, and there's a set of genes in that DNA that are going to be responsible for manufacturing the beta-galactidose protein. And there's also in this cell another molecule which is a repressor, and that's made in another place on this DNA. It's not made in this section, it's made in a totally different section. But DNA makes proteins that regulate the production of yet other proteins. And that's so much about how life works. So I'll show you a picture of what that guy looks like. So here's the DNA double helix coming along. And this repressor molecule has jumped on it, and you can see how it's kind of twisted it up here and kind of locked it off. And what it's doing is preventing the production of the messenger RNA to go out and start making this protein. It's basically shut the door on it. It's locked it up. So let's go back. Okay, so here we are. Now, so if lactose is absent, there's no lactose in the gut, Nature doesn't want to waste time making beta-galactidose because it's not needed, so we don't waste any energy doing that. So nature has evolved some very nice ways of putting a repressor on that gene and stopping it from making the protein. But now suppose you eat some sugar and you've got some lactose present. Now we've got to digest the lactose, so we really do need that switch to go on. Well, it turns out that this funny molecule that jumped on the DNA is got a little slot in it that lactose sugar likes to bind to. So if you've got some lactose lying around, it wants to jump on the repressor, and when it's done that, the repressor is now blocked. It can't jump on the DNA. So these guys just go back and forth. Now you can see they can oscillate back and forth, turn off the lactose, no more lactose to stop the repressor from jumping on, so it jumps on and stops the production of the cycle that makes the galactosides. So there you have a chemical computer, a very beautiful and kind of amazing chemical computer. So biological computation takes place in which this is one example. There are lots of other chemical circuits that are like neural circuits in which computation is taking place right now in our bodies in a rich variety of ways. So if the lactose is on, then turn the lac suppressor off, and if there's no lactose, turn the suppressor on. That's how it works. And what I want you to observe is biological molecules compute the if-then function. If something is true, then do this. And if it's not true, do that. Or don't do anything. We use if-then structures all the time. They're absolutely fundamental to everything we do, and they're fundamental to computation. If you're going to have a general purpose computer, if it can't do if-then, it's going to be a very restricted computer. And there are levels of power that different computational structures have. The highest one being what's called the Turing machine, which general purpose computers like your PC are as good at. But there are very simple computational structures like push-down stacks, where it's like having a stack of papers. You can take a paper out, you can write on it, you can put it back in, but if you need to get another piece of paper to write on, you have to take that one out. You have to take them out till you get down to the one you want, then you have to put them all back, and then you have to go searching this stack up and down. That stack structure is limited in what it can do. But there are computers that do that. So biological molecules are very smart, if we want to think of them that way. They're very intelligent. They can do if-then. So single cell organisms are intelligent, just as elementary particles are intelligent, and single cell organisms like E. coli are more intelligent than elementary particles because they got more to them. They're made of lots of elementary particles. They've got gangs of elementary particles, so you should be able to put those together to do something more powerful than what one of them can do. And now there's a fifth movement. There aren't very many sonatas that have my 5 movements, but there are 1 or 2. Beyond human beings, what can we say? So human beings have this nervous system. These are not bones. These are nerves. And there's the brain, central part of the brain. What about a forest? Well, it turns out that a forest is doing an enormous amount of rich computation. And a forest is very intelligent. So here's the brain in the sky, one of the ways that plants communicate. And one of the ways they compute is using the air as a medium for their signals. So it's like the brain in the sky. Volatile chemical networks by which plants communicate and compute. Now, a volatile chemical is one that vaporizes very easily and can go into vapor form. So what these plants are communicating with are molecules that are easily volatilized, and they're going in the air. So the air is like the wire. You know, your PC has got chips that are connected with actually copper that's laid down on circuit boards. Or if you had a really old, crude computer, it could actually maybe have some wires. The wires for the brain in the sky, wires are the air. The air is the wiring system. So, let me tell you about one of the things that is computed. Lima beans and corn are two examples of caterpillars can attack and eat lima beans and corn. And for the most part, the lima beans and the corn would rather they didn't, because there'll be less lima beans and corn in the next generation. But when these caterpillars begin eating, they release an aromatic compound which goes into the air. And that air is attractive to parasitic wasps. So the caterpillar starts eating, releases this volatile compound into the air. Parasitic wasp is hanging around and sniffs it and comes to it. And the way these parasitic wasps work is that they have an ovipositor, that's their ovary that deposits the egg, and they will deposit a bunch of eggs along the body of that caterpillar. Sometimes if you see tomato worms, you can see them full of these parasitic wasps, pupae. Have anybody seen those? They're quite a sight. So look around on your tomato plant sometime, and they're these big green tomato caterpillars. Most people don't like them, but sometimes you'll see one of those caterpillars, and his back is just full of these pupae, maybe about 20 of them, just riding on there, and they've got hooks into that caterpillar's body, and they're eating him, slowly eating him. The wasp comes, takes care of the caterpillar population, takes the pressure off the lima beans and the corn, and it's a computational cycle. The caterpillar started eating, the compound got released, it triggered an if-then cycle in the wasp. The wasp said, what's this stuff called? Octadecanoid jasmonate. Octadecanoid jasmonate. I smell octadecanoid jasmonate. Let me follow the trail of the smell. And it takes the wasp to where the caterpillar is. Now, the human brain has 100 billion neurons. But the average plant, when you go into the forest, when you part the soil in the woods, this rush of odors comes forward. All kinds of odors. And they're different depending on where you are. If you're in the desert and you smell sage, the plant world is full of odors. And they're wonderful, but they also are functional. Oops. I guess I was pushing the button here or something. Yes, there we go. The average plant has 3,000 different computational molecules. Molecules that it can compute with. So most of these are not in our sense range. We're actually very poor. We have a very poor sense of smell. But these plants they are tuned up to a high level of smell sense. So let me tell you a little more here. You might have, if you grow tomatoes, you might have also noticed that sometimes you see a little vine that's gotten onto the tomato plant and it's kind of wound itself all over it like a morning glory. That's called a daughter vine. And it winds itself onto the plant, and it basically is a parasite. It lives off the tomato plant. Well, this is a still from a film, from a video. I was just a little too complicated to try to show the video today, but I'm going to describe what's going on here. There's a tomato plant here. There's actually another plant planted over here, which the daughter vine doesn't like so much because it's not as easy to suck on. So you see the daughter vine, when it sprouts, it comes up, and if you do slow motion photography, you'll see it start just moving in an arc as it's growing out. And it's looking to find something to hit, and it hits that tomato vine, just hit it. And it's going to attach onto it, and it's going to crawl up and do that. Well, that takes intelligence, it takes computation, it takes sensory input, and so on. This is a mimosa leaf of a mimosa. There are several kinds of mimosas. They can be tree-like. If you touch a mimosa leaf, it recoils. It's very sensitive to touch. And presumably, it's because it's also very vulnerable to predators. And when it folds up the leaf, the predator can't get on the leaf and eat it. So if anything touches it, it does this fold up. Oops. So some biologists started to do some tests, and they wanted to know, well, how does it, first of all, there's a genetic endowment on the mimosa that makes it possible for it to do that. But how does it tell the difference between something that's harmful and something that's not harming it? I mean, why doesn't it just roll up in the wind? The wind blows on it and hits it. And so, obviously, the mimosa has some capacity, also genetically endowed, to learn. So here's what a biologist did who received an enormous amount of disrespect for it. People didn't think much of it, especially the big-time professional biologists, but they're starting to come around. She took a bunch of mimosa plants and rigged up an apparatus that would basically give them a shock, of a motion shock, like dropping, like boom, boom, bump. So they would get jolted. And when they get jolted, they close those leaves up. So she had a machine that was giving them jolts. And what she found was that after a while, they would stop folding up the leaves. And this happens a lot in animal experiments, where an animal thinks something is going to be a certain way and it's not. And eventually, like when I try to keep the deer out of my vineyard and I try a new technique, it may work for a few days, but then pretty soon they see it's not lethal, and so they're back. So this is very common, but here it is with the mimosa plant. And the mimosa not only engages in this behavior of contracting its leaves when there seems to be kind of an assault from a predator, it also can learn not to do that if it's not the real thing. The acacia tree is browsed a lot by antelope. And when the antelope aren't browsing, The acacia has a certain chemical composition in its leaf structure, and obviously would prefer it that way, I think, because it can use its resources then more productively to gather sunlight and make chlorophyll and make plant nutrients and so on. But if a predator is on the scene, it's willing to stop eating as well to defeat the predator. So when the acacia is browsed by the antelope, the saliva of the antelope will stimulate the acacia to start manufacturing some molecules that are mildly toxic. And so then the antelope doesn't like the taste of the acacia so much. And in some cases it produces so much toxin that it can actually kill young animals. But if you don't bother it, it's not going to waste its time making toxin. In the same way, the E. coli cell is not going to bother making beta-galactidose if there's no lactose present. Now I want to talk about not just the brain in the air, but the brain in the ground. Not only is the plant world all around us executing all this computation, intelligent computation, in the air, they are also executing intelligent computation in the ground. And these are with what are called mycorrhizal networks. Mycorrhizal networks are fungus root symbiotic networks. That means the plant has a root, and then there's a fungus that likes to colonize itself on the root. And they are symbiotic, which means they help each other out. So that's symbiotic connection there. So you've got fungus and you've got roots. So here is, I'm sure you've all noticed how rich all the root structure is in the ground. Again, if you go into the woods and just dig down, it's a massive tangle of roots all over the place. But it's not just roots. Those mycorrhizal fungi are all on those roots too. They are a big part of that network. So here is this underground network. Now, it's true that this network, this fungus root network, is collecting minerals, it is collecting nutrients and water and passing them on to the plant. But it's also doing a lot of computing. This network is computing like crazy. Well, what kind of things would it be computing? One of the mycorrhizal networks is a slime mold. Maybe you've gone into the woods sometimes and you see this stuff that looks like throw up, just growing. What it is this fungus, slime mold fungus. Well, slime mold is enormously intelligent. Here is a maze, for example. And if you put some food at the end of the maze, like oat flakes, apparently slime molds like oat flakes a lot, put some oat flakes there, erase all of this in here, and put a slime mold at the entrance up here, put a little deposit of slime. What you'll find after a while is that the slime will solve the maze. And it will also lay down a substance that tells it, don't go there. So the slime mold finds a path. It basically starts exploring, goes out exploring. If it doesn't hit any food, it eventually is going to switch that slime to say, don't go here. And the one that it's going to continue to go to is the one that has the food. So all of this purple has gotten the switch thrown to no, and the computer switch on the path that leads finally to the food is on yes, or on, or one, or F for food, and the other is in for no. The other thing the slime mold does is if you starve it so that it doesn't have any food, all of the individual cells, the slime mold is made of cells, trillions and trillions of cells. The cells will start aggregating together, and they'll start, instead of being all spread out all over the place in a blob, they actually will start organizing themselves together and make a stalk. Nice slender stalk. That same goo that was just all over the place now has turned itself into a stalk. And it's a fruiting body that will eventually bloom and fruit and release spores that the wind will pick up, because this hunting ground for food was not very good. The slime mold is starving, so it's going to say, we're sending you boys out to find a new place for us to live. Now back to the forest, back to that forest, which also has an enormous underground network of roots and fungi. Someone has called it the wood wide web, the underforest is a rich computational network. So the next time you're hiking in the forest, just think of all of the intelligent activity that is going on beneath your feet. And in the air as well. So evergreens and paperbark birch will actually trade nutrients on the fungal network, and they will help each other out. Where one is kind of dry and starved, the other one will help it and then get back in return help and aid. So intelligence is everywhere, but we don't know about consciousness except on our planet. And beyond planets, what can we say? And beyond carbon-based chemistry of life, what can we say? Because all that I've talked about here is based on carbon chemistry. Well, not the elementary particle parts. I mean, those could be anything. But the complex computation, all this complex computation is based on carbon life chemistry. Well, one of the things that people say, well, it's because you don't know there is a hidden force. There is a hidden thing that is making everything happen. And you just don't know what it is. You haven't discovered it yet. So there is the possibility of new particles and fields yet to be discovered that compute as well or better than carbon-based computational networks. Is that possible? Well, I want to mention that we do know about a new force. It's called quintessence because it's the fifth. There are four fundamental forces in nature at the basic physical level. Everything else is just combinations of that. There is gravity, that's the weakest. Next is electromagnetism, that's the next weakest. Then we get to some strong forces, what is called the weak nuclear force, but it's actually quite strong. That's what radioactive decay, like radium and your wristwatch that glows in the dark, is based on. And then there's the strong nuclear force, which binds protons into nuclei. That's what makes the nuclei of atoms. Those are the four forces that we have known about for the last 150 years. Well, that we've known about all four of them for about the last 60 years. But now there's this stuff called dark matter. And dark matter means it does not interact with light, does not interact with the electromagnetic force. It does interact with gravity. So, if a quintessence is somehow a mysterious force that, for example, can explain how you can have intelligence and consciousness without matter, without something for it to root in, whether it's a PC chip or a neuron or a fungus and a root. Can you do this without matter? That is a key question. Now, the people we started with, Bergson and de Chardin, never thought of this as even a question. To them it was unquestionable that the universe was just full of a mysterious spirit that we just don't know how it works. But it certainly is intelligent, and it is clearly maybe the next step in the mind of the universe. So for people in past generations, it just didn't even seem to be a question. But once you understand how computation works, it becomes a serious question, and it can guide the credibility of your speculation. What's the problem with quintessence? Well, the problem with quintessence is it doesn't interact with light and electricity, which means it can't interact with the essential nervous system and brain of animals. All of what I've talked about, chemistry, is all based on the electromagnetic force. Well, there's nuclear chemistry when you have nuclear reactions, but you don't need nuclear reactions to explain life. So quintessence then, if it were this mysterious force that has the answers to life, the universe, and everything, unfortunately, it doesn't interact with life. The other thing about the universe and consciousness as a whole is the universe is mostly gas, and a lot of it is either really hot or really cold. Gas is an elementary collisional computation. That's the most elementary computation you can have, we talked about originally. It has no rich molecular structures comparable to proteins and DNA. So here is a gas with the particles just chaotically bouncing all around. It's difficult to see how you can do anything with gas aside from the most elementary computation unless you put it together with something else, like pneumatics or something, and have a pneumatic computer, but then that's got some solid objects and other things mixed in. If you just have a pure gas that is sitting out in the universe, it's very hard to see how it could be conscious. Finally, let me say something about exotic forms of matter. There's plasma, which is charged gas. It's gas that is made of ions and electrons. And so it can feel electromagnetic forces. And indeed, you can do some things with plasma. One of the things that people would like to do with plasma, and have been trying for 50 years now, or maybe more like 70, is to confine it into a spherical ball. Take this hot ionized gas. What it wants to do is squirt all over the place. And what you would like to do is put some magnets around it, and maybe some currents around it, electrical currents, and make it hold itself together in a ball that would be compressed down so you could use it and cause a fusion reaction to occur, and therefore get fusion nuclear power, which has been something that people have been trying to do now for decades and have not succeeded. It's very hard to control the plasma. So plasma, it seems to be highly questionable. Then there's rare earth chemistry. That is chemistry that's based on elements that we have very few of on the surface of the earth, But they have odd properties. These are the elements that semiconductors are made out of, for example. And so maybe it's possible to have some kind of chemistry that could support computation of a complex kind that would be sufficient for consciousness. And then there's also all of the silicon-based life. If you're a science fiction fan, you'll find all of these things well represented in the science fiction literature. But I don't see, from my perspective, any compelling advances on consciousness and other kinds of computational structures. So as far as we know, consciousness seems restricted to complex molecular networks built on the carbon chemistry of life. Oh, I put this in. I put that in because this seems like a discouraging thing to say to people who would like to just really brainstorm, people who see the universe as magical and mysterious, and we just aren't appreciating it because we haven't discovered its magic and mystery. And I put this quote from Shakespeare, that familiarity breeds contempt, because we are living in the midst of this rich computation that's going on in the forests and in the air and in plants and in animals and in even elementary particles. It's not as intelligent, but it's still intelligent. There's a lot of intelligent activity going on in just the atmosphere because it's not total chaos in the atmosphere. A lot of the flow is very organized, coming from the cold, hot equator to the cold poles, creating these vortices, beautiful vortices. That's intelligent behavior. It's not intelligent enough, I think, to be conscious because it doesn't have the ability to reflect on itself, to see itself doing its thing. And finally, I'd say for religious people, especially religious people who aren't interested in science and think that science is kind of a sideshow compared to the religious perspective, they just say, God does everything, God takes care of it, and that's how it works. I'll just say one last thing about faith and science. Faith, we are finite creatures. We are always going to be in the dark about something because we're finite. And therefore faith is about the leap from the known to the unknown. It's a leap from the known to the unknown. And what that calls on us to do is to have the greatest respect for the known, the greatest respect for the physical, the greatest respect for what we know, what we can see, what we can measure. Be very respectful of it, pursue it, and from that make a healthy and robust platform from which you will necessarily have to make a leap. So I'm going to stop there. Questions? Comments? Some of this was trying to explain to people how fundamental computation is to the physical world, that just about everything we do is a very big challenge. People don't understand what you're talking about for the most part. And I had tried to do it right down to the on-off switch. Something that could either be this way or that way. If you had a universe of 1 bit, or of 0 bits, a thing that can only be on, it could never change. To have a dynamic universe, that is changing and growing and evolving, you need to have capacity for lots of possibilities. For the universe to move from state to state. And when you count up all the atoms and molecules and all their states, it's a huge number of states, huge number of configurations that all these atoms and molecules can be in. Even only counting the ones that are useful not every possible molecular configuration you can have. Some of them are not very useful. Some of them can do that beta-galactidose stunt for the E. coli. But a lot of proteins, you can take, the proteins are strings of amino acids. So that there are 21 amino acids. So you can take the amino acids and combine them in all the possible ways you can combine them. You get this huge combinations of strings of atoms, even when the number is not very big, like 100. They're huge, but a lot of them are just not useful for life. And yes?
When you're starting in the very beginning of this concept, they are fairly simple, and then they branch out and get like this. Is that kind of like a fractal?
John, can you repeat the question loud so everybody can hear?
This starts out on the particle level fairly simple, but then it seems to, as it progresses, get larger and wind up somewhere like this. Is that comparable to a fractal?
It's, in most respects, not. Now, a fractal is basically, if I have like a little recipe that says, if I have a stalk here, well, I want, whenever I have a stalk with an end, I want to add 2 branches to it. That's the rule. So now, then I go out to this branch, now I've got to apply the rule again, so I add 2 branches there, go out to here. So you can see a bush is forming. The reason that genuine intelligence can't be just fractal is too simple. It's a simple recipe repeated over and over and over again. And actually, in some ways, nature does need that. If you have to reinvent every leaf from scratch on a tree, the computational burden is immense. But if you have a simple recipe that you can just push the button on it over and over again, you can make lots of leaves. So we need, nature needs for economy of effort, nature does create lots of fractal structures. We see them, you can see them in nature. But at a deep level, for its progress or its motion from the very simple to the complex, it needs genuine, innovative computation, not just keep doing the old recipe. Yes?
My mind kept wandering to what we call extrasensory perception.
Yes.
And I was just trying to think about the possibility of a scientific study of how that communication takes place, if it does.
Oh, this is a slightly painful subject.
Yeah, okay.
First of all, I was actually going to show a slide. I don't think it's on here. I'm pretty sure it's not. No, that's the last slide. I was going to show, there's a new app out. A new app. And it's called, I don't know, Universal Consciousness or something like that. And venture capitalists in Silicon Valley are behind it, and they're trying to use it. It's actually, I don't think, got some venture capitalists, they know better, but it's got a crowdsourcing aspect to it. They're trying to crowdsource it. And it's an app where you put in where you are, and everybody else turns on their cell phone and puts in where they are, and it's to see if you can make something happen, because everybody is tuned in. Well, obviously, if everybody's tuned in to do something, like let's all jump up and down on 3, and everybody does it, well, obviously this is universal consciousness. But it's not flying through the air. Well, it is flying through the air as electromagnetic waves to the cell tower, which is a pretty interesting and pretty stunning thing. I have a friend who is a very fundamentalist Christian, and who basically thinks science is kind of secondary. And she said, you know, that's really amazing how cell phones work. I don't know how they do that. But it's magic, isn't it? It is. It is. That's back to Shakespeare. When you get familiar with it, when you get familiar with the smell in the woods, when you get familiar with watching the vine, the daughter vine crawl around the tomato vine, you just don't notice how miraculous and amazing it is. And that's the familiarity breeds contempt. So we're always on the lookout. We always want the new. We want something that we don't know, something that would startle us, something that is wow, has wow factor. The most powerful thing is, well, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. What I was thinking of is somewhat credible instances of communication, maybe through some distance, for which we don't understand the physics.
All of those experiments can be shown to be inconclusive or wrong. I don't know how the reputation keeps going, but Dean Radin manages to keep it going, and all kinds of people say, no, we're noticing this little tiny effect. It's not explained by chance. Well, the experiments that they're doing are so, they involve people trying to, think thoughts through the air. There's a subjective element. You've got to have a big effect, and the effects are all small. If it's true that what they're talking about, it would be a significant effect if you neglect any of the questions about the experiment, if you just accept the conditions. But those experiments are so easy to question, and the effects are too small to be credible. So don't put your money on the Consciousness Universe app.
I don't think I will.
But all of this ESP stuff it's the best you can say for us is murky and inconclusive. That's the best you could say. So there's ESP, yes. Well, that's where the sort of hidden force would come in. I'm actually acquainted with a guy who's a very big enthusiast of this, and we actually had some exchanges about this. And he basically says, well, there's just another force we don't know about. We don't know about it. But I'm measuring its effect. Dean Radin is measuring its effect. All the people who do ESP experiments. That's what they're measuring the effect. You physicists don't know how to describe it yet. You don't know what it is. But we're measuring that there's something happening here. And that's another troubling thing about it. When you say, what's the mechanism? How does it work? When you ask for what's the mechanism for acacia trees poisoning antelopes, a good plant biologist can tell you what the mechanism is. But when you ask what the mechanism of ESP is, they say, we don't know. Nobody knows. There are a lot of things we don't know. That's true.
But in fact, you believe there's any such thing as ESP?
Personally, I do not.
Okay. I was thinking my grandmother and her sister sat around after my uncle's death, and my ex-wife was there. And the situation scared her witlessly, because what we were doing is we were carrying on a conversation without speaking. And I was in on it, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And I'm just wondering if there's something with regard to brain waves and close communication, that there's some kind of a physical.
What was the conversation about?
about the weather and the future, and it was things that would be somewhat predictable given the social situation. Nothing unusual.
Did any of you have a thought about the Gobi Desert? And then the others also had thoughts about the Gobi Desert?
No. Nope.
I think context. We use context.
Yeah.
It's a very important sense. We don't have time to compute everything that somebody's telling us.
Yeah.
When somebody's giving us a narrative about something they did, I did this, I did that, and I went to the house, we're filling in the blanks.
Yeah.
We're filling in all the spaces because we're not precisely able to pull in. We'd choke on a fire hose if we took in every bit,
Right.
especially visuals. We're constantly paring down the visuals to only the essentials. And so there's a certain commonality that people are going to have when they pare down. But more importantly, context sets the
So you
stage.
think it's basically exchange of nonverbal cues in terms of familiar.
Well, and
things.
just a history, just your personal histories.
Yes.
Where you've been together, what you've been doing together, what you've been doing separately. I had somebody say that they had been transported to another place and were led around by a kind of prophet and told and instructed about some spiritual matters. But it was completely biblical. It was completely from the context of that person. It wasn't there wasn't anything surprising about it. The only thing surprising about it was that magically being transported to another place, maybe like a desert or something, or maybe a city with lots of rubies, I don't know. But when people tell you stories about mystical experiences, which I don't want to downplay that. I would say that genuine experiences that are mystical are also very homely, very unpretentious. And there's nothing wrong with them basically drawing on all of our history and our experiences that are in our brains and seeing them in a new light that we couldn't see them in when we first took them in. You don't need what the Tibetan Buddhists call juju. Juju is and there's another version that some modern people would use called woo-woo. Woo-woo and juju are fantasy claims. Now, since nothing is completely provable and nothing is completely unprovable, everything's on the table, I guess, and you can take your choice. But my personal sense is that the physical world is the platform, is what we make our leaps into the unknown from, and we should give it the greatest respect and the greatest consideration. Yes?
I have been in a situation where I've never been before, out in the middle of the desert at night with several friends. This was when I was in Tucson. Now, I was raised in New York State. Okay, first time out of state was Arizona, and we were young, wanted to party, so I'm out in the middle of the desert, generators, and it was like I had been here before. I had been there, before. And how do you explain something like that when you have an experience like that?
I don't know. You have to explain.
I don't know if anybody else has had this happen to you before, but it's a real strong sense of, oh my gosh, I've been here before.
Had you never been to a desert before?
I had never.
Had you ever seen any movies that had powerful desert scenes?
Not that I can remember.
I read that deja vu is caused by momentary lapse in your brain. There's two streams of this information, and one's just slightly nanosecond ahead of the other. And the second time you sense it, you say, well, I've sensed this before. And that's, is that the same right, George?
I don't know.
I've read that.
I've read it too.
George Carlin had a joke about that. He says, if you say Vujardez, I ain't never been here before.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so I don't think I can say much. Yes.
I have a question about universal consciousness.
Yes.
The experiences of some people, like a woman will be driving down the road and all of a sudden she'll have this great feel that, or great intuition, if you will have it, that her son is in dire trouble. He's getting ready to, he's either in a swimming pool drowning or something. And she will rush home, and sure enough, you'll find that this is what is happening. Do you believe in this sort of universal consciousness, or how do you explain some of the things that people feel and happen? And
I guess I'd feel that I don't know what to say about it. I don't have those personal experiences myself. I have had experiences where a thought has suddenly come to me, but they're a little too mundane. Like I left a pot on the stove and I forgot about it, and then I'm out and about and I suddenly remember it. But that's too mundane, I guess. But I don't think those kinds of things are irrelevant. But I'd say that the burden of proof, or the burden or the challenge, is to explain the mechanism other than...
like what triggers it?
Yeah, how does it work?
Yeah.
We know that once it gets into your brain, it's very physical. So how did it get... And how does something that's not physical get into the brain that is physical? Those are serious questions, which a lot of the proponents of ESP and parapsychology and so forth
No, I don't believe in ESP.
don't address. But one other thing, we build up an enormous amount of intuitive experience. We're designed to do that. We have that capacity, and so we have great intuitions, great premonitions, great kinds of unconscious as well as conscious intuitions, and that is a fact, and those things do play roles along the way you're thinking. I think we'll continue in discussion while we have a